We'll shift gears now, and I'll ask you to join me in welcoming our next panellists. And the subject is the city deals. What's the deal with affordable housing? This is a strategy that I guess we can ask the Minister to tell us more detail of. But let me introduce who we have on our panel today. We have Professor Nicole Gurran from the University of Sydney, excuse me, down the end. We have Clover, of course, who is the Lord Mayor of Sydney, and Geoff Roberts, who is from the Greater Sydney Commission, and Angus Taylor here on my right, who is the Assistant Minister for Cities and Digital Transformation. Please welcome our panel. Now let me grab my glasses so I can see what's happening here. Excuse me. Angus Taylor, the city's deal is focused on 6 themes, and I have to say, when I was looking at the material around the city's deal, it just looks like a bunch of words that we hear every time there's a new government and every time there's a new minister. Infrastructure and investment, livability and sustainability, housing, innovation and digital, governance, jobs and skills. It all sounds really great. In the end, how does it make housing more affordable?
Well, at the end of the day, the difference is we're doing it. That's the difference.
What is it that you're doing?
Well, essentially what a city deal is it's sitting down with state and local government and saying, let's come up with a compact for the future of this urban centre or this city. And what's different is that we have never done that before. It's unique in our history. Other countries have, the UK in particular, pioneered this. And it's a way of saying, look, when we've tried to work together to solve many of our problems historically, we've done it through COAG. And we all know COAG has had both successes and failures. It's a very difficult forum to get things done. Doing this, though, working across the 3 levels of government and the private sector, is much easier to do at a local level, where we're working in a city or an urban region. And that's exactly what we're doing here. So if you look at the outcomes from the first 2 city deals signed in Townsville and Launceston, it's very specific initiatives focused on a clear set of goals, KPIs, if you like, key performance indicators, around jobs, housing, whatever matters in that urban centre. Now, what's really crucial here is what matters in a city. This city here, a regional city, is very different from what matters in a different city. There are huge differences.
Can I just interrupt you for a minute and just pick you up on those 2 particular examples that you've indicated? The city deals in Townsville and Launceston. Aren't they just a bit of pork barrelling? You've put a sports stadium in Townsville and a university campus in Launceston.
Okay, so let me pick you up and I'll start with Launceston. Launceston is moving towards being a regional university city, and the way we're doing that is we are shifting the campus from the edge of the city into the centre. Now, many of the great universities of the world are regional universities. I went to one. Oxford, Cambridge, many other great universities are regional universities, and they are absolutely integrated with the city. What we had in Launceston was a university campus on the fringe. We've taken it into the centre, we're integrating it with the city, and we're integrating it with the industry. The whole layout of it is being done so it's fully integrated with the city. There's work around the city centre that's being done to make that integration work, and with it, attracting students, jobs,
they wouldn't have gone where it was before? I can't imagine Launceston's that huge, it was such a massive trend.
Well, this is the thing, is that university campuses in regional cities work when they're in the centre of the city. They work best when they're in the centre of the city. Go to Oxford, go to Cambridge. It's exactly what you said.
So if Oxford or Cambridge were just a few kilometres down the road, people wouldn't have gone? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I am saying is that universities work best in regional centres when they're integrated with the city, and that's exactly what we're doing in Launceston. It's a very significant investment for that city. The University of Tasmania, the Vice-Chancellor, has been passionate about the importance...
And this is not about votes in Tasmania because you're not doing those flash in Tasmania.
So this is about the future of Launceston. And it's a regional city, and I was very keen to focus early on regional cities because We have many of our biggest challenges in our regional cities. We have job shortages in our regional cities. We don't have that problem.
But this was about moving a campus, so
Well, except that
isn't it net the same number of jobs?
No, there will be significant growth in jobs.
Okay, we need to
in
introduce
Launceston.
the other
There is
panellists
significant
into this
growth in jobs.
conversation. Let me go to you, Clover Moore. What's your perception of the city deals in terms of their ability to deliver more affordable housing? We talked about two initiatives, a sports field and a sports stadium and a moving of a university campus. I can't understand how
You
that
didn't
delivers...
let me get to Townsville, but anyway.
I know, but we need to talk about other things, and we will get back to Townsville, I'm sure. But Clover Moore, in terms of delivering affordable housing, do you see the city's deals as a way to do that?
No, I don't in any way, and I was hoping that I would learn about it today because I don't have any evidence of it so far. And you know, we have a really serious affordable housing crisis in Sydney, and we know we need a robust federal policy that supports providing affordable housing. At the moment, and we need a state government that supports provision of affordable housing. At the moment, both levels of government support increasing supply, and they think if you increase supply, it will flow on that housing will become more affordable. Well, I've got to tell you, the City of Sydney's 26 square kilometres generates 25% of the state's economic activity and 10% of the national economic activity. Over the last, while I've been mayor, we've approved $25 billion worth of development. There's amazing supply, and there is 1% of affordable housing in our city. And you know, it's
Did you just say 1%?
1%.
And what do you define as affordable housing for the city?
I define it as housing, as worker housing, really, housing for low to middle income people who are essential for the running of a global city, the people who are driving the buses and working in hospitality and teaching in our schools and working in our police stations, who are paramedics in our hospitals. You know, currently they work in our city, and because there isn't an adequate supply of affordable rental housing, they then have to travel to the Blue Mountains or Gosford because that's where they can afford to rent or buy property. And so it's a really serious situation, and I don't believe in doing a city deal with a city here or a city there is really about a robust federal policy. I think there should be a robust federal policy that says that the federal government and the state government will work together with local government to ensure that there's going to be enough affordable rental supply, and that they'll have targets and policies to achieve that. And that could mean, for example, that 20% of all government-owned sites go to affordable housing. It could mean that the state government would allow local government to apply levies to all development. I mean, there are many mechanisms that could be used, but we don't see either level of government using them at all. And I think it's really quite scandalous.
Do you want to have a quick response to Clover Moore?
Well, I mean, I think the starting point is Clover clearly doesn't want a city deal, so fine. That's
Sorry.
Clover's saying I think she doesn't want a city deal, so that's okay.
I just don't think you should do deals in places where you think you're going to get votes. There should be an overall policy for
Clover,
the country.
Let's be frank. Western Sydney needs a city deal. We need to get Western Sydney working.
The whole of
Townsville and
Sydney
Launceston
needs a city deal. We need affordable housing. We need affordable housing so that people can live relatively close to where they work, so that they're not spending half their life travelling. And that's across the metropolitan area. It's not just in one area.
So let's be clear. City deals are not just about affordable housing. They are about what is needed in a city. So if you go to a regional city, frankly, the number one issue is not affordable housing. We know the level of mortgage stress in Launceston is the lowest of the 21 largest cities in Australia. The lowest, right? Our problem there is jobs. That is
The median, I can
that is-
actually tell you
that
that
is
the
the
median house
fundament.
price
But
in
we're talking
Launceston
affordable housing
is
today.
385,000 and in Sydney it's 999,000.
So the point about a city deal that's so crucial, Clover, it is focused on the needs of that city. Now, you go to Western Sydney, we have the highest level of mortgage stress in Australia. It's about 1 in 10 people are suffering from mortgage
But you have
stress.
a whole lot of people who are homeless too, and you have a whole lot of people that can't afford to pay the rent who are living in real crisis.
Yeah, and
because of that.
so their housing is a big issue. So a
There
city
is.
deal,
So-
city deal is customised to the needs, the issues that have got to be solved in that local area, and this is where policies that attempt to solve a problem across all of Australia all at once fall down. You have very, very different local problems, and what we're doing.
So what are you doing for affordable housing in Western Sydney?
Well, there's a whole series of policies that Michael Sukkar was talking about earlier in this session that we're doing on affordable housing, and we'll be announcing the Western City Deal in the very near future, and it will have
So just
affordable housing.
Tell us
doing
the
anything.
most important one.
The fundamental issue in Western Sydney and Sydney more generally is, and I'll go right to the numbers because the numbers don't lie. We had 17,000 houses a year built in Sydney between 2004 and 2014 across Greater Sydney. To keep up with just straight population growth for Australia-wide population growth, so assuming Sydney didn't grow any faster than any other city or region in Australia, we needed 35,000 a year, right? So it was half. So we need good housing sites across Sydney that are close to work, that are close to transport and roads, that are well connected and that have amenity. And you've got to solve the whole problem. You can't just
what
say.
are you doing about that?
Well, we're spending $10 billion in Western Sydney right now.
Doing what?
Putting local jobs in place around the airport,
But what are you doing
roads,
about housing?
a spine, and housing can go with the transport.
What are you
code.
doing about rental housing?
Well, we will announce the full city deal in the very near future, but the point is you don't solve the housing problem unless you solve the connectivity problem, the amenity problem, the local jobs problem. All of these things have got to come together in that local area, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Let me bring in our other panellists who are probably not going to bicker amongst themselves. Nicole, Gurran, what's your impression of the city's deals?
Well, I don't think I know any more than Clover, but let me say there is a small tradition of what you might call strategic funding agreements between central through to local governments, and we have had it in Australia. I think probably for me the high point was the early 90s, the Building Better Cities program, which, you know, I would welcome a new city deal, if we want to use that language now. I would welcome a new deal that improved on and enhanced that model. Of course, the Building Better Cities program, which we see in Sydney, was the Piedmont Ultimo renewal area, and which led to really our only legacy of using the planning system, for instance, and looking at new housing development as a catalyst for affordable housing and homes for workers as well, which is our legacy of affordable rental housing in Piedmont Ultimo. That was conceived as a pilot project. That model was to be replicated, and very sadly it hasn't been able to be replicated due to barriers within state planning policy, perhaps wider policy failures, which I hope we'll talk more about later today. So I think in concept there's potential, but certainly the international research, and I'm very delighted to say that Ahuri's actually funded the University of Sydney and a number of other universities in collaboration with us to do a study on what good strategic funding deals of this nature have looked like overseas. But certainly the international literature, as I understand it, is mixed. And the types of issues that we've heard bicker about just a moment ago are that they can be seen as very untransparent. The fact that they're place-based and bespoke can be an absolute strength, but it's also problematic when we're dealing with some wider systemic issues, which is certainly the case with housing. And the other comment that I'd make is that generally city deals and their sort of equivalents in the United States, except for the community development block grants, have not been front and centre around housing. And so I think if we are, and I can't see any other policies at this point in time, though I hope you might prove me wrong, Minister, but I can't see any other great great hopes, if you like, at the national level in terms of solving the national affordable housing crisis. If City Deals is to play a large part, then I think we're going to have to get the housing elements of them right.
Do you think City Deals should put housing affordability and housing generally at its core?
I do think that is a major opportunity, and we've got the effective model of the Building Better Cities program. We certainly have examples in the UK of Manchester, of Birmingham, of Newcastle, where affordable housing is front and centre. I think the principle is that whenever we are doing something that can catalyse development, and certainly that's happening in Western Sydney, whenever we're doing things to make economic development and urban development better and kick along, then we have to embed affordable housing as part of that process, because otherwise, and we know certainly in Sydney, well-located housing near transport and jobs is in short supply. And so if we don't embed affordable housing opportunities at the very start of that planning process, then unfortunately our low and moderate income earners and our workforce will be forced to move actually away from the very places that we need homes for them.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Geoff, but doesn't the Minister have a point that in this enormous investment, for instance, in the airport in Western Sydney, jobs will flow, and presumably people in Western Sydney will find those jobs and be located as a result near where they work?
Well, not if they can't get to them, Emma. So let me just make 2 points. I'm a commissioner. I'm the Deputy Chief Commissioner, but I'm also the proud District Commissioner of the Western City, and I lead the New South Wales Government negotiation in the City Deal. So if I could speak as a Commissioner on what our housing policies are and then go into the City Deal space, maybe that would help. On the housing policy side, we have both the region plan, the metropolitan plan, and the 5 district plans on exhibition at the moment. I would be surprised if there's... I hate this not being able to see anybody, by the way. I would be surprised if there are... Hello.
That's better.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. It's a very us and them situation, which is actually what we're trying to work against in Western Sydney at the moment. In our district and region plans, there's quite a comprehensive set of housing policies that include supply, but importantly also include a new policy initiative, an affordable rental housing policy initiative, which I would love the people in the room to respond to and help us make better in the current exhibition phase. Those documents are on exhibition.
Can you just give us a bit of a précis on what it's all
Well,
about?
we have a policy that for uplift in the Sydney Basin, that 5 to 10% of any uplift would be affordable rental housing.
Yes.
What do you mean by uplift?
When an area is being rezoned, where somebody's going to increase the number of housing numbers in a particular area, that 5 to 10% of those housing would be included as a mandatory part. In the old days, we would call it inclusion.
Would be better than nothing.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. Now that would be in the old days.
How would that
call
work in
Can I just
practice? Just one second. I just want to help understand this. So say a developer is doing a 100 strong block.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that 5 of those apartments have to be
subject to viability, and the Commission will be the arbiter. Now, look,
subject to viability?
Subject to viability.
What does that mean?
Well, in some parts of Sydney, it is more viable to do that than in other parts of Sydney. So you can read this policy quite openly. It is, in the old days, we would have called this inclusionary zoning. I think for the people in Sydney, this is quite a revolution, possibly a revelation, to be able to be talking about this sort of policy.
Is that in all parts of Sydney? Or
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So I live in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, and there's a 10-block apartment that's just going up next door to me.
Which suburb do you live in? Bronte.
I live in one of the beach suburbs, yes, but not Bronte. But besides
Panorama,
which,
Bondi.
I'm pretty certain that developer is not giving any of those apartments.
Because there isn't a policy.
That's because we don't have a policy yet.
Yes.
So the Commission has proposed a policy. It's been, frankly, quite a brave thing for the Commission to do. It is a commission
But
exhibited...
you can't make private operators
Can I-
provide social housing, can you?
We're not talking about social housing, we're talking about affordable housing.
So can I just, Emma?
Yes.
So
Sorry, before we continue, let me welcome our latest panellist who has snuck in on the end there. That's Andrew Giles, the Shadow Minister for Schools and convener for Labor's Better Cities Policy Committee. Thank you.
Finally be here.
Well, you say that now.
So far it's been fantastic.
By the way, do you want to sit here? I feel like I should be sitting next to Nicole.
can I
You're going well, isn't it?
Yes.
can I just take up this question of affordable housing? You talked about the better buildings,
Building better cities.
building better cities, the Brian Howe policy of the early 90s, and it focused on Pyrmont Ultimo. And we have, at the City of Sydney, have inherited that legacy. And so since that time, the City of Sydney has been applying a levy on all development in the Pyrmont Ultimo area, and it has also been extended to the Green Square area. Now that has enabled us to provide 800 affordable housing units, and this is not social housing, this is worker housing. And we have 1,500 in the pipeline. We have sought the former Labor government and the current coalition government to enable us to extend that levy right across the city. Because if we had been able to do that, we would have much more money in the kitty to provide to community housing suppliers to provide affordable rental housing, which is what people in the city need, so that they can be living close to St Vincent's Hospital, close to King's Cross Police Station, or wherever they are working. And so if that could be a policy that applied across the metropolitan area, we again would have a kitty that would enable the provision of this housing. We collect the levy and then we make it available to a community housing provider. And that is a specific way of ensuring there is that housing. We do a lot of city talks at the City of Sydney, and you know, the feedback we get is that millennials want to rent, they don't particularly want to buy, just as they want to use public transport, they don't particularly want to own a car. This is you know...
They'll all be in driverless
they'll
cars
be,
soon.
you know, they work in startups, they're involved in the disruptive industries, and, you know, but they do want to be able to live near to where it's happening, and they do want to be able to travel to where it's happening.
Let me draw...
I want to go back to the city deal, though, at some
we will.
stage.
Oh, no, we will. We've got plenty of time. That's the whole session's on the city deal.
So if the Greater Sydney Commission could actually have some success with their housing policy, which is about applying a 10% levy to all development, we've only been able to apply a 3% levy, but you know, we have approved $25 billion worth of development, and we have a very good working relationship with developers in the City of Sydney. And so this is, and they accept that levy because, and they've told me if it's mandated, we will do it.
Yeah.
There's a fear of governments, of developers, and it's crazy. You know, they're corporate citizens, they need to be part of the process. You know, cities don't work for the business community if the workers who run the city can't afford to live anywhere near it. You know, so it's about good governance in the city.
So Andrew, does Labor support the city deals?
Well, we do, and we've got a couple of reservations about the model that is being applied to city deals, and I guess there's a further caveat in terms of today's conversation in terms of seeing city deals as a panacea for a whole range of responsibilities at federal government level, and obviously it'd come as no surprise that we think unless we look at tax concessions, we're not going to really deal with issues around housing affordability. And I was really pleased to see that there was some discussion about rental affordability as well as affordability to purchase too, which is another part of the puzzle. But in terms of city deals, we have been enthusiastic for the concept. We've seen some great examples overseas. We're looking with great interest at what's happening in the two that are underway, and we're particularly keen from a housing affordability point of view to see what comes from Western Sydney. Our concern really is around the transparency through which a bidder can get into a city deal. The criteria, there have been good criteria set out in terms of the Smart Cities framework, but how they're to be applied to a city deal and then the process of selection, these are the real concerns we have, Emma.
What do you mean about how you decide as a government where the money is allocated?
Well, I've been speaking to a lot of councils, and particularly those in the areas I represent in Melbourne. all of whom are interested in the concept of a city deal, the concept of a partnership where there's some buy-in at an infrastructure level by the federal government around some shared economic and indeed social objective, and then the other side of it being some sort of sharing of downstream revenue. I think everyone's excited by the concept, and we think that that can drive the sort of innovation in city shaping, including around delivering affordable housing and housing that's fit for purpose, including for deepening labour markets. But what councils and indeed I think some private sector and state government stakeholders don't understand is the criteria through which the federal government will say yes or no to a deal proposal.
Well, Angus Taylor tells us it's got nothing to do with votes. Yeah, they're not buying votes in Townsville or in Launceston, so we cleared that one
Or
up.
the northern suburbs of Melbourne.
Well said. So, if I may.
Yes?
I think the criteria are very clear. And by the way, the deals themselves are incredibly transparent. You can download them. The two completed, they are there. Have a look at them. I really encourage people to have a look at them because they're extremely transparent. The commitments are clear. There is extraordinary level of accountability, which is crucial when you've got cities because there are so many stakeholders involved. In terms of the criteria...
Do you have cities actually applying?
Yes. Look, it's hard to think of a local government area, perhaps with one exception now, who doesn't want one. Right, so
No,
we've found
I didn't say that. I want you to have
all right,
policy.
I'll take that as a...
I want you to
I'll
have
take that as
policy
a
for
compliment.
affordable housing.
So most local government does want to do one. Really, one of the most critical criteria is can we collaborate across all three levels of government? That is absolutely crucial because they don't work unless all three levels of government can work together. As I say, local government is usually a very willing partner. State governments, the experience has been much more mixed. And we've done city deals with Labor and Liberal governments. So it's not so much about the colour of the state government, but it is about whether that state government wants to work with us in that area. In Melbourne, the Victorian government hasn't been enthusiastic about us working there. That may change. We keep talking to them and we're certainly keen to do a city deal in Victoria.
Okay, before we continue, we'll just pause there for a moment because it's important to let you all know that this is an interactive session, a polling session. So you'll need your PACE conference app ready to go on your smartphones or devices. If I can ask you to get them out now, but make sure if you don't mind to set them to silent. You might notice mine's on silent, but occasionally it flicks a light down there. I apologise for that. To participate in the polling, just tap the live polling icon on the home page of the app. And I'm about to ask you our first question. So if you're all ready to go, I will do so. And our first poll question is, city deals will be good for affordable housing supply. You've had a brief introduction to what they're all about. You can press A for agree, B disagree, or C unsure. And your time starts now. Very dramatic. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so 65% of our audience, or thereabouts, is unsure. 11% agree it will be good for affordable housing supply, and 25% think it won't be so good. But I think overwhelmingly what we see from that polling result is there's a genuine lack of understanding.
But Emma, the point is that, in a sense, they're right. If you go to Launceston, it's not the problem to be solved. The problem to be solved is how do we get more regional jobs into that city? Whereas you go to Western Sydney, it is a crucial issue to solve, but you can't solve it unless you also get transport links right, the amenity right, and all the other pieces around it. So it can only be good in those areas where it matters. Where it doesn't matter, you don't worry about it.
Are you saying there's any place in Australia that doesn't care about affordable housing?
I am saying that is a much bigger issue in Western Sydney than it is in Launceston, ×3. The numbers are very, very clear on this. And when we put out our performance framework, our national performance framework for cities, which is coming out in the very, very near future, you'll see just how different our cities are.
And I'm guessing that there's still a lot of homeless people and domestic violence sufferers and so on in Launceston.
Right, but we don't have 1 in 10 people suffering mortgage stress in Launceston.
No, but they've got different requirements
we have 3%.
that mean there is a need for affordable housing. It's
Right.
not all about mortgage stress. People are renting.
Sure.
People are rendered homeless for various
But
other reasons.
the rental stress is about a third of what it is in Western
But that doesn't
Sydney
mean
as
you don't need affordable housing in Launceston.
Of course not. But the point I'm making is that the emphasis has to be right for that local area. And this is where federal governments, I think, have got themselves into trouble in thinking that the answer to every policy is this sort of blanket solution, when in fact you do need housing policy at a national level. Of course you do. But you also need to have local solutions that are customised.
Let me ask Nicole, do you think there's transparency as to the process? Angus Taylor says yes, in terms of how these projects are determined. So Launceston presumably has gone to the federal government and said we need to move a university campus. That is the priority for our city to get it going. And the government determines, yes, of all the funding we have for city deals, the two we're going to fund are a sports stadium and the moving of a university campus. They are the biggest priorities. Well, you said that it's a system that is about determining where the money is best spent, and it's a rigorous process.
I think it's a leading question, Emma, and I'm going to let it lead me in a slightly different direction. Because
She's
obviously,
a real diplomat, isn't she?
obviously we've only got 2 and possibly 3 on the table, so it's difficult to generalise. And the issue being affordable housing, it's a national housing conference. Affordable housing is a national problem, and it does manifest very differently across Australia, but it certainly does manifest beyond the capital cities as a problem. And so I actually think we need to be clear, and part of the lack of clarity, aside from the fact that city deals are place-based and affordable housing manifests in a place-based way, but is problematic nationally. We need to ask, what do we mean when we talk about affordable housing? And I think one of the things that a lot of the HURI research has pointed to over the past decade is the need to actually think of Australia's housing system as a whole housing system, and to really understand the way that the housing market operates as well. Now, because our very low income households and our low income households, and in the cities, our moderate worker income households as well, now face barriers in the private rental market. They also face barriers, of course, when it comes to entering home ownership. We've got a very large sector of the population that now needs housing assistance. In fact, I think research out of Curtin has showed that there's at least 500 million Australian, 500 million households that actually can't access housing without assistance, even in the private rental market. So that gives us a sense of the sector. Now, to deal with that, we either need to double our affordable housing supply, and that's probably a good starting point. But city deals are not necessarily the vehicle to address that wide need. So that's the first thing I want to put on the table. So when we talk here about affordable rental housing, and perhaps affordable rental housing through the city deal, it's not clear to me if we're talking about low-cost starter homes for teachers and police and for a workforce that could quite properly have aspired to home ownership, or if we're talking about rental housing for people who can pay quite a lot actually for their rents, again, teachers and police, or if we're talking about the very severe needs which also manifest in Western Sydney and on the margins of our cities, probably in Launceston as well, certainly northern New South Wales and Queensland, whether we're talking about that sector of the population and strategies to address their needs. And what I want to put on the table is actually that we need to look at that whole continuum of needs and then look at what funding we have available, what policy mechanisms we have available, and also what regulatory tools such as the planning system, and the way in which that jigsaw of interventions, of funding can then interact with new house building and city building, to use some jargon, but to start to deliver housing that meets local and regional needs across that continuum. And we have to do that through the private market. So perhaps later we can talk in a more sophisticated way about inclusionary zoning, but the Greater City Commission have got one method on the table. I think that's useful. City of Sydney is using a levy model, that's another model. There's spaces in between, but I think we need to, when we're talking about affordable rental housing, let's talk about a continuum of housing needs from very, very low income groups through to people who are just missing out on first home ownership.
Geoff, I'm going to come to you, but I just want to remind everyone that you can use the app. It is working now. I should be able to get your questions if you submit them through through your devices. So please do so if you want to become involved in this conversation, as I'm sure many of you will want to, and I will come to them as I see them popping up. So please feel free to send through your questions for the panel. Geoff, is there a sense that there's too many layers of regulation to get through, too many layers of government to sort of penetrate before you can actually start to tackle this issue?
Gee, it's hard. I did want to say that the Western Sydney City deal includes 8 councils, 1 million people today, 1.5 million people in 20 years' time, and 2 million people in 40 years' time. So we're building Adelaide west of the M7. It is very complex. You know, the most impressive part of my involvement this year in the city deal is the response of local government. So I work, and I must say the Minister does too, daily with each of those 8 councils. The way that they've hunted as a pack, and I frankly think the City of Sydney has helped this over time with some of the 100 Resilient Cities and other work that you've done, Clover. But the way that those councils are working as a group of regional councils and are moving away from a Me Too syndrome is actually quite impressive. But the degrees of freedom and the degrees of this falling over just makes my brain hurt at times. So yes, there is a lot of complexity. Affordable housing will be a critical component of the Western Sydney City deal. But the biggest problem, and I'm not just talking about people who know about housing. The biggest problem in Western Sydney isn't housing, it's actually jobs. We've got 200,000 people a day, we call them the squinters, squinting driving into the sun east in the morning and squinting driving west into the sun in the afternoon. Now that's not funny. A lot of the affordability issues to do with Western Sydney is the cost of transport to get to a job. So we're building an airport, and I think both governments need to be congratulated for that, but the smart jobs around the airport won't just arrive. We need to actually work in a coordinated way to create a knowledge economy for those 2 million people in Western Sydney. Universities, we talked about the university in Launceston. There are 220,000 university places in Sydney. 160,000 of them are east of Ashfield. Is it fair for a young child in Campbelltown to have to go to university at Kensington each way each day? We're actively working to make university cities, and it is true that university cities work best when they're in town centres. We're making Penrith, Liverpool, Campbelltown and Blacktown university cities as part of the joined-up approach to do with the city deal and with the GSC's policies. So I'm quite optimistic that the city deal can deliver for the everyday people of Western Sydney. But the failure rate is, it's not just about doing the deal, it's then about implementing the policies in the deal, right? But if people can't get to and from jobs or to and from their homes, there's not a lot of point in the whole thing. So at the moment, we've orientated Sydney as having a front door and a back door. We need to rethink Sydney as having 2 front doors. We love our first city. It's the core economic machine of the whole country. I don't think that'll ever change. But Western Sydney has a major role to play in our national economy and in providing a much better quality of life for those people that live there now. We haven't done well for those people today.
I've got a couple of questions for you from the audience. Thank you. They want to know how many meetings negotiating the Western Sydney City deal have been public meetings.
Depends if you define council meetings as public meetings. There's probably been hundreds of meetings to do with the Western Sydney City deal. In each of the councils involved, they have debated on the floor of their chambers publicly city deals.
But I guess the tenet of the question is, do you let people know that you're going to be talking about the city deal and invite them to participate?
The councils do,
Right.
yes. The councils do.
And the other question, Geoff, was, have you done a financial feasibility assessment on the ability for not-for-profit community housing providers to deliver affordable housing as part of that 5 to 10% when you've limited it to very low and low-income earning households, while targeting to highest need is commendable? They need moderate income earners to help meet the cost of delivery and operating costs of affordable housing.
So I think that question, the answer is yes. We've done a significant amount of modelling on the 5 to 10%. One of our key housing strategists, Troy Daly, has done a lot of that work, and some of you in the room would know Troy, as well as our CEO, Sarah Hill, who's one of Australia's best-known housing people. The question of moderate income housing is a question that I think we've still got more policy work to do. We have focused on the greatest need across the whole city. I'm now outside the city deal conversation because we've got an intersection here of policy across the whole city and then the city deal, which is being applied to one of the 3 cities of Sydney. I think we've still got some more work to go on the moderate income housing space. But frankly, we've focused on the highest need, and that's taken an enormous amount of effort to get us to where we've got to today.
Andrew, does Labor have any particular strategy for dealing with mortgage stress? Is there anything a federal government can do to relieve mortgage stress? Someone's just written here, Digby Hughes has said that more than 14% of households in Sydney are suffering rent stress, and he reiterated what Geoff mentioned about 1 in 10, or was it? It was the minister. 1 in 10 families in Western Sydney experiencing mortgage stress. Is there anything governments can do to alleviate that?
Well, we could actually take seriously the fact that low wage growth is one of the key drivers of both mortgage stress and rent stress. So that's probably an issue that's apart from what most of this conference is about, but it goes pretty much to the core of this issue, not just in Australia, but across the developed world. We also think, again, to go back to another canard of this debate, we think unless we deal with the very generous tax concessions that are currently in play, we're not going to deal with these issues at large. When you come to people on existing mortgages, well, I think it goes to the overall state of the economy beyond simply questions of supply. But there's a lot the national government can do. And I think to wind back a bit...
So what?
Well, to wind back a bit, I mean, the key question that
We've had 25 years of consecutive economic growth. We're doing all right in the international scheme of things.
But who's we, though, Emma? That's really the question. And I think that's one of the conversations that played out at the New Zealand election. They'd had a similar record of economic growth. The government was thrown out because that economic growth has not been evenly distributed. And the housing debate in Australia, both in terms of ownership and in renting, I think is the sort of barbecue stopper manifestation of this inequality conversation. And but stepping back from a national government's responsibility rather than to the barricades ideological argument, I think we've got to think about how do we get across these issues of governance that beset Australian policy making. You touched on that a minute ago. And that's really why we're talking about city deals, because there isn't one governmental entity that can engage with the full breadth of these questions. They're just a means. And similarly, I think we've got to think at a national government level, what are the ways in which we can effectively understand what is happening in our big cities especially, so that we can shape either directly or indirectly policy responses. And that was at the core of Federal Labor's approach in institutions like the Housing Supply Council, which was abolished, I think, 4 years ago today. Near enough to, in understanding through the State of Our Cities report what was happening in advance so that we could craft cooperative national policy responses.
Thank you. Minister, argue for our audience why we shouldn't be looking at negative gearing and winding back some of those capital gains tax concessions that allow investors to gobble up so much of the housing market and at such incredibly generous, with such incredible generous concessions from the government?
Well, I think the starting point, you and I have had this discussion before, is to understand that every housing market in Australia is different, and that's why a single cross-market solution is not going to be the answer to this problem. And in fact...
But in our two biggest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, this is a very big issue.
Correct, but it's not in other cities to the same extent, which is the point I've been making earlier. And actually, if you look around the world, no matter what the tax regime, all sorts of tax regimes, the global cities of the world, like Sydney, have a problem with housing affordability and mortgage stress. You go to San Francisco, New York, London, Paris, you name it. All these great global cities are growing fast on the back of a knowledge economy, high incomes, wealthy people, well-educated people who are at the heart of driving that growth in incomes. And that is driving a situation where housing supply isn't keeping up in the right places. You can put housing in the wrong places, but not in the right places. And we have an unaffordability problem.
But if you want to talk about international comparisons, there is no comparison to Australia when it comes to household indebtedness. We are the Olympic gold medalists.
Scandinavian countries are actually slightly worse, but we're right up there with Canada and a number of other countries.
No, we're above Canada.
But if you look at the great cities of the world, one way or another, Emma, we've all got this problem.
And you don't think our tax system encourages people to take out loans to buy housing?
My point is that if you just look at the data, the great cities of the world all have this problem, and the huge challenge is, given their enormous success in creating high-value, high-income jobs, is how to get the right housing supply in the right places. There's no point building the houses in the wrong places to keep up with that. Now, the truth is, if you talk to I think some of the best housing economists in the world, a guy like Ed Glazer, I know you're speaking to Ed, they will tell you again and again and again the same thing. It is, we've got to free up the supply of housing.
And then you talk to Sol Eslake, who is well regarded as one of our best economists in this country.
Ed is a leading global housing economist, and he will tell you the same story.
Topic. If we want to talk about the world's leading economists, I don't want to interrupt, but we've got a couple of books here. Haven't had my name on it, if I can, but co-written with actually some stellar economists. This is Glenn Bramley, UK advisor, housing economist in the UK. Here we've looked at Ireland, United States, England, Hong Kong and Australia, and looked at the relationship between housing supply and housing affordability. And let's just say that Glazer is not held in high regard by other housing economists elsewhere in the world. I mean, Ireland tripled its supply output over a decade. House prices went up by 5 times. I can't think of the mathematical term for that. Went up by 5 times. What brings down prices, of course, in Ireland was the GFC. Here again...
We're not recommending we go.
Absolutely not. I mean, there is a solution, a way that we can avoid all of that. But just on the question of supply, it is a political question. I really want to put that on the table. This narrative of supply means affordability is really a political narrative. It scores very high on the rhetoric meter, but it doesn't score very high on the evidence meter. And here we looked at 3 countries, England, Australia, Hong Kong, very, very different settlement patterns, very different housing systems, very different economies. And yet in all 3 countries, very different planning systems too. And yet in all 3 countries, apparently, it's the planning system constraining housing supply and pushing up prices. Obviously, that's a political narrative, and we need to move beyond. I'm not saying that supply is not important, but it is not the way to solve our affordable housing crisis. Not generalised market supply.
Let me query this. So in Sydney, we've had half the number of houses population growth would have required over that 10-year period I described earlier. And you're saying that hasn't contributed to house prices?
If we look actually over the decade, and we're in a position to be able to do that now, and we've had some research from Ahuri, we've also had research out from the ANU, but that has shown over the 15-year period, we have actually pretty much met population growth with housing supply. Not only that, I mean, last year Australia nationally produced more homes actually than we've produced since World War II. In Sydney, Geoff's probably more on top of the figures than I am because they move, but there's somewhere between 70,000 homes approved in New South Wales last year, over 40,000 in Sydney, and certainly nearing 40,000 completions over a couple of years. When you look over 15 years, there's not a significant deficit. When we look at our census data, we see, if anything, vacant homes rose marginally, again over the decade, again demonstrating that there's not an absolute shortage, but there is a critical shortage. And I actually do want to talk about why supply is important. But the critical shortage is actually at the bottom of the market. And because for all of the reasons that you said, Sydney being a global city, Melbourne being a global city, what we don't see is what we would theoretically like to see, is that new supply filtering down, allowing, you know, lower priced homes to filter down in the market.
And just very quickly before I go on to Clover more, where do you see taxation as, where does that sit in this whole argument about housing affordability?
Okay, so we've got a system that does encourage investment in rental housing, and in part that's because we don't have anyone else investing in rental housing. We don't have a properly funded social housing system investing in social housing. If we want to talk about getting supply back and getting stable supply, irrespective of the peaks and troughs of the housing market, we have to be very serious about building the social housing sector, and the bond aggregator model is a very, very welcome, you know, contribution to that space.
You mean government housing, Nicole?
I mean government housing, and institutional investment in affordable rental housing. And what we really need to do is make sure that whatever we're spending in the housing space is delivering what we really need, and that is affordable new rental housing supply. And so negative gearing, I'm not myself a housing economist, so I'm not going to talk about its impacts on the market. But if we say, is it delivering affordable rental housing and new supply, is it contributing significantly to new stable supply, I think we'd have to say the answer is no. And so, in my view, we need to target whatever policy, whatever subsidy, whatever funding we have, much more towards stable housing production at the bottom of the market, which is what we're not delivering.
Clover Moore, can you oblige developers to provide affordable housing stock, and how do you do that?
Well, we impose a levy in the two areas where the state government allows us to, and that's in Pyrmont Ultimo and Green Square. And as I said, it's produced 850 affordable housing, rental housing units, and 1,500 in the pipeline.
Are you looking to expand that?
Well, yes, we've got a proposal two proposals actually with the state government currently. One is to be able to extend that levy right across the city, and the other is specifically for the Central Business District, and that's about ensuring we keep jobs in the Central Business District as well as providing affordable housing right in the CBD. We've put a proposal up that has had a very positive reception from the industry, from developers, the development industry. It's been actually sitting with the state government for over a year now. We just want to put it on exhibition. Because it would be a way of ensuring, at a time when developers really want to do residential housing, that we keep enough commercial housing in the Central Business District for the provision of jobs into the future, and it would also allow the provision of affordable housing right in the heart of the Central Business District. And as I said, the development industry has received that very warmly, because we also looked at sites where we could, wouldn't be overshadowing our important public places like Hyde Park or Martin Place, where we could increase height and floor space. So, you know, we're accommodating future development, future jobs, but also accommodating future housing. And in terms of supply, the City of Sydney has really contributed extraordinary amounts to the supply. But because we haven't been able to extend that levy, and because state and federal governments haven't had a policy about providing affordable rental housing, we have a lot of expensive housing, and we have totally inadequate affordable rental housing for worker housing, and we're just on the cusp of having enough social housing in the city, but we will need more because the state government has evicted those social housing tenants from Millers Point. So, you know, it's about ensuring, and the work we've done on our plan, which is Sustainable City 2030, shows that we need at least 15% of low-income housing in the City of Sydney for it to be a successful, sustainable city, and that's 7% of social housing and 7% of worker housing to support activities in the city, but we only have 1% of worker housing in the city. And we do everything we can. We use our planning controls where we can. We make sites we own available to community housing providers where we can, and we have a fund where we support community providers like Salvation Army or Heaven Care to provide youth housing, crisis housing, housing for elderly, homeless people. So we're doing everything we can within the limitations that local government's able to operate under. But we would love to have a city's policy that had the federal, state and local government working together on a common outcome, and that is to say we will have sustainable cities where everyone is welcome to live and everyone will be able to afford to live, and they won't end up on the street like that tent city we had in Martin Place just fairly recently. So that doesn't come through supply. We're providing the supply, but we need the policies to ensure some of that supply will be for lower income people, and developers have said if it's mandated, we will do it. Of course they'll complain, and of course political parties will worry about getting donations, etc. But this is about equity, and it's about cities that will work into the future.
Well, I think developers are not allowed to donate politically anymore, so that gets rid of that problem. We're going to go to another poll question, so if I can ask you please to get your devices out once more. And the question is, the key opportunity offered by city deals is to link affordable housing supply to A, economic development and jobs, B, transport infrastructure, or C, joint action by all three levels of government. So I'll give you a moment to look at the question. There we go. Results. Okay, so the majority of people thought it was about a joint government initiative, which is about right. Angus Taylor, is it not?
Yeah, look, that's important. I'm actually surprised the transport number is so low, because having housing close to transport is such a hugely important issue in both Sydney and Melbourne.
But is that what the opportunity is of city deals?
In Western Sydney, that's a very important part of it. There's no doubt about that. Geoff might want to comment on that. But you know, the great challenge in Sydney is congestion levels have gone up, jobs in the east, and housing has grown in the west, as Geoff pointed out. And connectivity between jobs and where people live is a hugely important issue. And in Western Sydney, if you start talking about housing developments without talking about the supporting infrastructure, you know, people will lynch you, and rightly so. The two have got to go together.
Especially in Western Sydney. Can I ask you this question that's come through on the iPad here, Minister, from Paul Adaby? He asks, will every local government area get a city deal, and what's the time frame?
No, I mean, look, the first city deal in the UK, by the way, which is the first one done in this form in the world, was done in Manchester, and it took them 3 years. So we've done our first two in about a year, and our third one soon after. So we're moving at a much faster pace. Look, as I said...
But is that the sum total? Like in Townsville building
So you
a
clearly haven't
stadium
read it, because there's a lot more to the deal in Townsville. The stadium is one... In fact, the whole renewal of the city centre itself, which is much more than the stadium, is hugely important. But there's a whole industrial renewal program around the port, around the rail, around an industrial area next to it, as well as dealing with water issues, which are a fundamental barrier constraint to growth of the city. So there's a range of issues that had to be dealt with in Townsville, and are all in it, and I really encourage you to read it, because you'll see the full suite of initiatives, not just one, as fundamental to that deal, including governance changes, establishment of a development corporation to speed up the development.
So how many deals do you intend to do?
So we'll do as many as we can, but importantly as state governments are willing to do. And this is the crucial point, is that some state governments have been much more willing than others. Collaborate, Geoff made this point earlier, you cannot do this without collaboration. You know, cities aren't built by any one player, they are built by a collaboration between different levels of government and the private sector. And so it's that willingness to collaborate at all three levels of government, as well as the private sector, that is the most important criterion. And where we can cooperate with state governments, we'll keep moving forward.
And another question here, just to stick with you for a moment, is from Peter McMillan. He wants to know what's in the City Deals pipeline. Are any cities proposing that additional affordable housing be in the deal? And what are the criteria? Is it just jobs and growth?
No, the criteria are broad. The criteria for doing a city deal, as I've already outlined, so I won't labour that. But there will be more city deals. I'm not going to announce them here.
Why not?
Now. Well, much as I think this is a wonderful session, I'll hold that off. But there will be more. Of course, there are going to be more. And look, the important thing we wanted to do is model...
Can you give us some idea, without saying which cities, what sort of things you're looking at?
Yeah, well, we're looking at cities. That's what we're looking at. But I'm not quite sure what you mean by the question.
I mean, what sort of initiatives,
yes.
Without telling us the name of the cities,
yes.
What sort of initiatives are you working on?
Well, very similar to the ones that I've already outlined for Western Sydney, for Launceston and Townsville. They're the same, whether it's jobs, housing, connectivity, livability, governance, all of those things.
Biodiversity.
In fact, in Western Sydney, that's been a very big part of it.
Biodiversity is a top 3 issue in Western Sydney.
Absolutely. And so all of those issues matter to differing degrees depending on the city. And this is the point. Let's not pretend that there is a single solution for every city. There isn't. We have to customise them. You can't do all of that at once. We wanted to model, establish a model that can be used in a bipartisan way in the future, where we can solve the biggest problems of our cities, and it was crucial that we got the first 3 right, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Clover Moore, are the planning regulations in Sydney fit for purpose? Is part of the problem to do with...
This will be a short answer.
Look, the biggest initiative on the planning horizon in Sydney metropolitan area is the Greater Sydney Commission. And they've got their work on public exhibition now, and they've worked with each of the councils to develop district plans. And that's going to be a very effective way of planning our city into the future. So that's a very good thing. But, I mean, currently, I think what we'd like in the City of Sydney is to have a very cooperative working relationship with the federal government and the state government, because we do contribute so much to both the state and national economy. And that's not our experience, which I find very disappointing. And I think, why has our Central Sydney plan, which would be so good for the economy of the nation, been held up by the state government for over a year? So that's a question mark with the Minister for Planning. And why has the City of Sydney not been able to extend the levy across the whole of the City of Sydney? That proposal's been with them since March. And I'd previously put that to a Labor state government. And just imagine the amount of affordable rental housing we'd have in the City of Sydney, the global city of Australia, the most expensive place to live in Australia, if the Labor state government had enabled us to extend that levy right across the City of Sydney in 2009, which was when we asked them if we could. We've been waiting on the coalition government for a number of years as well now, and it's this, as I said before, this sort of fear of the development industry. But, you know, the development industry gets that a city's got to work, and the city's going to work when you have people who can afford to live there who help run the city. And when you don't have people sitting in congestion. And that's one of the reasons why we're so opposed to WestConnex, just adding to congestion and the misery of people's lives for sitting in gridlock. You know, that's not about city living. So, and that WestConnex is very much about planning. The Greater Sydney Commission can't talk about WestConnex because that decision's already been made. It was a Tony Abbott, Barry O'Farrell project that could be costing $15 billion down the track. And yet the Greater Sydney Commission, the new important planning body for the whole of the metropolitan area, isn't allowed to talk about that. And yet at the City of Sydney, we're looking at 120,000 vehicles coming into the City of Sydney when our biggest problem, apart from a lack of affordable housing, is congestion, and that's costing $16 billion a year to the economy. And yet they're constructing WestConnex and destroying the biodiversity of the communities along the way. You know, that is not good planning.
I'll just give you an opportunity to respond, Andrew, before we look to wrap up because we're almost over with the session. But what's your plan as the alternative government for Western Sydney and solving some of the dilemmas we've talked about in terms of making that a more affordable place to live?
Well, as a Melburnian, I don't think there's a scarier question I could be asked, in Sydney anyway. I'd be very comfortable answering it at home. Look, what I think we need to do is to have a much clearer national framework for what we expect from urban policy. That's, I think, the core responsibility, and I think that's the central failing of the present government in this regard. I think we've also got to understand, whether it's about affordable housing or some of the wider objectives you can talk about in city deals, understanding how our cities are being shaped at the moment and what we can do, I guess, at a macroeconomic level to make sure that we're continuing to maintain the benefits of agglomeration, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, while making sure that we are not creating cities that are divided geographically and socially by reason of the experiences that people are forced into through housing affordability and their ability to fully participate in what should be thriving economies. And that's really the central challenge, I think, for Western Sydney, to build an economy that's related to the global city of the traditional Sydney centre, but to look at realistic opportunities to diversify high-quality jobs and to not have those jobs beset by congestion, which is, I think, the biggest handbrake on productivity in Australia at the moment. And certainly my constituents tell me every day it's the biggest handbrake on their livability as well.
Well, you did very well at not answering my question, but I won't pull you up on that.
Practice apparently makes perfect.
I'm going to go to our final poll question. So if I can ask you to get your devices out, it's a nice way to end the session, I think. And the question is, I am optimistic about the prospects of affordable housing supply being addressed through city deals. A, yes, and B, no. And your time starts now. Not a great deal of optimism, but I think we can put that down to a kind of still...
You're a hard audience, I reckon.
But I think there's still probably some confusion about...
It surprises.
You know, there's only 2 deals that we know about, I guess, and we don't know about them
Emma,
in any
I
thorough
would
way.
just say that many in the audience are right about this. It's not the purpose of some of the city deals. In some cases it will be. Western Sydney, it absolutely is an important issue. But it just depends where you go, and this is the great point about cities policy. Cities policy is about the needs of that city, not the needs of the federal government, and that's the point.
And I think it would be remiss of me to not ask Angus Taylor, just before I say goodbye, what he thinks of the Deputy New South Wales leader's comments today about Malcolm Turnbull's leadership, because they cross paths in regional New South Wales. He says the people in regional New South Wales are not too impressed by Malcolm Turnbull's
I
leadership.
thought we were talking about cities.
Well, this is an important part of cities, that he represents regional New South Wales. He says regional New South Wales has lost faith in Malcolm Turnbull.
Well, I don't agree with that. And enough said.
Fair enough. I won't push you on it. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Please help me in thanking our panellists, Andrew Giles, Nicole, Gurran, Clover Moore, Geoff Roberts, and the Minister Angus Taylor. And thank you all very much.